the return to Old Maple Lane. Eleanor had not intended to return to Maple Lane. It was a mere happenstance, a coincidence of fate, or perhaps, as one might say in quieter moments, the will of time. She had left that place many years ago, in the youthful naivety of ambition, like so many others of her generation who believed the world outside the small, insulated town could offer more excitement, more meaning, more life. The city had welcomed her with its relentless pace, its steel and glass edifices, its voices that never seemed to tire. But something had lingered, something that, like a forgotten tune, refused to dissipate in the rush of modernity. And now, with the subtle passage of years and the quiet disquiet that follows a life too full of trivial pursuits, Eleanor found herself standing again at the edge of Maple Lane. It was not a grand decision. She had been passing through the countryside, her mind lost in thoughts of things distant, when, almost unconsciously, she veered toward the familiar road. The sky, heavy with the promise of twilight, cast a soft sepia light upon the earth, and the air was filled with that autumn crispness that only comes with the dying days of the year. The street stood silent, almost tangible in its memories. The once vibrant houses now appeared to have lived through ages of seasons, their colors dimmed by the passage of time, while the encroaching ivy, like a living testament to the years that had passed, wrapped its delicate tendrils around the forgotten corners of the bricks. This was a place that seemed to hold its breath, patiently waiting for someone to stop and remember the laughter and love it had once known. Her gaze fell upon the house that had been hers. The red door, once a symbol of warmth and security, now stood solemnly, worn and discolored with age. The windows, opaque and still, held no secrets, only the dull remnants of lives once lived. Yet even so, a great wave of recognition swept over her, not of the house itself, but of the place it had occupied in her heart. How many days had she spent there, running barefoot in the yard, the earth cool beneath her feet, the wind mingling with the scent of fresh grass? How many summers had passed beneath that great oak tree at the edge of the garden, where the sun flickered through the leaves, making a mosaic of light and shadow? She approached slowly, as though afraid to disturb the slumber of time. The gate, once pristine and gleaming, now sagged with the weight of years, yet Eleanor found herself pausing before it. In the quiet of that moment, she heard only the sound of her own breathing, and perhaps the faintest murmur of a past long silenced. There was no hurry. She let her fingers brush the iron, cold and rough to the touch, a reminder of the many seasons it had endured. The past, it seemed, was a creature of elusive beauty, appearing only in fragments when one least expected it. In that instant, Eleanor was transported, as if by some delicate magic, back to the days of her childhood, when the city had not yet claimed her, before life had added its layers of burden and complexity. Her brother's laughter echoed through the yard. Her mother's voice called them to supper from the kitchen, the warm scent of home-cooked meals wafting through the air like a promise of comfort and familiarity. The memories came rushing forward, sharp and clear, yet somehow tinged with the sadness of their inevitable fading. How naive she had been then, how unburdened by the complexities that would later shadow her days. She could almost hear Mrs. Carter's voice, soft and wise, recounting tales of the old town, of days before the streets had been paved, before the shops had turned to commercial facades. But even Mrs. Carter, Eleanor realized with a pang, had long since passed from this world, leaving only the echo of her stories behind. Yet these reflections, though full of warmth, were bittersweet. Time, that unrelenting force, had not spared even this place. The world had moved on, inexorably, as it always does. What remained now were fragments of herself. Fragments of the people she had loved, fragments of a world that had once seemed so whole and full of promise. Eleanor turned from the house, her steps deliberate, slow, as though reluctant to leave the solace of memory. There was no need to linger. The past would never truly return, not in the same form, not with the same light. But it would remain, unseen, perhaps, but deeply felt, like the soft murmur of a long-forgotten tune. As she walked down Maple Lane, past the trees whose gnarled branches swayed like silent sentinels, Eleanor understood at last that there is no returning to the past, no matter how often we wish it. All that remains is the quiet, enduring presence of memory. And in that, perhaps, there is comfort. For Eleanor, there was no sadness in this realization, only a kind of peace. She had returned to Maple Lane not to reclaim something lost, but to acknowledge that the past, with all its beauty and fragility, had shaped her in ways she could never escape. And that was enough. As Eleanor moved further down the lane, the setting sun painted the sky in streaks of gold and orange. The world around her felt both familiar and distant, like an old song that she had once known intimately, but now heard only in fragments. The air was cooler, and she pulled her scarf a little tighter, comforted by its soft warmth. In the distance, the old bridge over the stream came into view, evoking 1,000 memories of childhood races and afternoon errands with her mother. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth by decades of footfalls, now overgrown with moss. The stream that once gurgled with the energy of life was now quiet, as if reflecting the passage of time. Eleanor paused at the edge of the bridge, her gaze drawn to the still water below, which seemed to have absorbed the light of the fading sun and the pinks and purples of the sky, like a mirror of time. The stream no longer chattered with the sounds of youth and vigor, but whispered softly in the gentle breeze that swept through the nearby trees, as if in a quiet conversation with the past. In that moment of quiet reflection, a memory came unbidden, of her father's voice, strong and steady, recounting the history of the ancient bridge. It has stood here longer than any of us. Through storms, through summers, through winters, it remains. His words had carried with them a profound sense of permanence, a mysterious power of time that seemed to permeate the landscape itself. Perhaps the bridge, like the old oak tree or the rustic gate, had been imbued with a quiet strength that defied the passage of time. As her hand rested on the cool, worn surface of the stone railing, Eleanor felt the story of countless childhoods nestled within the texture of the rock. The years had passed, and those children had become adults, scattered like pebbles in a river, their lives flowing in different directions. It was this ebb and flow of life that was so constant, so inescapable, as if the world itself was a constantly shifting tide carrying everyone and everything forward on its currents. And yet, the bridge had remained, a constant in the flux of time, solid and enduring. With each step she took, Eleanor felt a profound sense of distance, as if the world she had known had slipped away, becoming a faint apparition on the horizon. The road she walked, though familiar in its shape and form, no longer held the same enchantment, no longer resonated with the same memories. Maple Lane had become a foreign land, a distant echo of what it once had been, and Eleanor, a traveler passing through with no home to call her own. In those moments of reflection, Eleanor saw that the promise of the city had been a mirage. The thrill of ambition and possibility had masked the reality of loneliness and emptiness that had crept into her life. She remembered the times when she had laughed with old friends, the smell of her mother's cooking, and the warmth of a quiet conversation. These were the things that mattered, the things that defined a life, and these were the things she had left behind. The city had given her success, but at what cost? Eleanor found herself seeking solace in the insistent rhythm of work, in the relentless pursuit of success and accomplishment. She had built a life, carefully crafting its every detail in the hopes that it would fill the growing void within her. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet but persistent longing remained, a longing for something she couldn't quite name or touch. It was the space left behind by time, by places, by people she had known and loved, a space that only grew larger as she continued on her solitary path, distancing herself from the very things that had once anchored her. Standing on Maple Lane, her old street, Eleanor finally understood. The longing, the emptiness, the sense of displacement that had haunted her all these years, it had been a yearning for connection, for a sense of belonging, not to the artificial promises of the city, but to the simpler, quieter things that had once formed her identity. She realized now that the city, for all its excitement, had failed to fill the spaces in her heart that had been carved out by her past, by her childhood home, by the people she had once loved. As the final light of day waned, Eleanor found herself near the old oak tree where she and her brother had spent countless afternoons. The fading sunlight cast its warmth upon the tree's gnarled branches, which swayed softly in the gentle breeze. The leaves, colored in the rich hues of autumn, rustled like a whispered conversation, reminding Eleanor of the laughter and love of her youth and the time that had passed since then. Sitting beneath the old oak tree, Eleanor closed her eyes, surrendering to the gentle sounds of the evening. The rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft hum of life carried on a breeze all enveloped her in a sense of calm, of peace that she had longed for. In that moment, it seemed as if time had slowed, or perhaps even stopped altogether, and Eleanor found herself wrapped in the comfort of the present, deeply connected to the tree and the world around her, a part of something larger, eternal, and yet quietly fading with each passing second. The desperate chase, the incessant need to prove herself, had given way to a quiet acceptance of what had been, what had passed. Eleanor had not come to capture the past, but to recognize its place in her life, to accept it as a part of who she had become. As the night grew deeper, she understood that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life are not the great achievements, but the small, silent moments that invite us to reflect, to remember, and to find peace in the present, to simply be and appreciate the fullness of life, both past and present. In the velvet night sky, a single star shone, a humble beacon of light amidst the darkness. Eleanor, basking in the quiet stillness of the evening, looked upwards with a grateful heart. For even as the world around her had shifted, even as time had continued to flow ever forward, she had discovered something that lay beyond the brief moments that make up our lives, the memory of a home, a place, a feeling that would always remain deep within her, no matter where life's journey took her. With one last lingering look at the street that had once been her home, Eleanor stood, ready to leave Maple Lane behind once more. But this time, she knew that the memories, the moments that had shaped her, would never truly be left behind. The tree that had sheltered her, the lane that had welcomed her, the stream that had provided refuge, these things would be carried within her, like the flickering light of a candle in the night, illuminating the path of her future with the gentle warmth of remembrance. And as she walked away, the night air cool and crisp against her skin, Eleanor understood that it was not the return that mattered, but the quiet acceptance of what had come before and the way it would shape the journey ahead. As she took each step, it was with a new understanding, a new sense of peace, that she accepted her past for what it was, a part of her, guiding her, shaping her, but not weighing her down. And with that, she walked on into the future, a future that was hers to create, hers to shape, hers to hold,